All right. Specifically requested by pastor to make sure it's recorded. So like we're in good hands right now. All right, so we're picking up with the Masoretic text. We started it last week. This was pretty fun study for me. I noticed, interestingly enough, just give you some background when I started working on the Masoretic text. If you're reading books on translation of the Bible, they will usually give you a paragraph or two of the Masoretes, who they were, and the Masoretic text. And then they might go on for quite some time about the Masoretic text itself as we have it today, but almost no background whatsoever as to why it ever came to be. And I'm talking, I went through probably, I've got like 8 or 9 different books on the subject. And I actually had to, and I think I mentioned this last week, I had to go to Jewish history to understand why the Masoretic text came to be. And it was a fascinating study to actually go through the Jewish history to see the events that led up to the Masoretic text. Because in Christian history, it's not Christian history. Masoretic text is not Christian history. It impacts Christian history. We use it. It's amazing. It's definitely God's providence and sovereignty working among the Jewish people to bring this out. But for church history, right? In church history, it just shows up. It just appears on the scene, and we're like, oh, we need this. We're going to use it. But it's not really Christian history. It's not Christian people who are involved in the work. It's Jewish people. So it was actually fun to kind of see pastor work through Christian history during these time periods while I was working through Jewish history during these time periods, and just see the two different perspectives, the connecting of the dots, as he put it, between the two groups of people. And so last week we started talking about as a way to deal with the events that led up to the Masoretic text was the fall of Rome. We needed to start talking about the fall of Rome. And here we have a 2nd century rough idea. I was just doing some rough maps of the expanse of the Roman Empire here at its largest, at its strongest, and how they were being attacked. Their economy was falling apart. Different emperors were vying for power. And so you got some nomadic tribes attacking them from the southeast and the northwest. And they were trying to defend their borders, and they were incapable of doing that. But they actually end up doing it to some extent. But in the process, Rome ends up splitting into two. It's still Rome, but it's East Rome and West Rome. And East Rome eventually becomes the Byzantine Empire. And so the Byzantine Empire is now Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. There was always this push and pull between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. I say always in the sense of we're talking about Greek-speaking people versus Latin-speaking people. There was this contention between them. They were generally unified on most subjects, but then there were a few subjects that ended up splitting the church. In fact, they divided over these issues, and you end up with the Byzantine Empire, Greek or Eastern Orthodox churches, and the West Latin Roman churches. And you end up with the split, not just secular, like you see on the map, where we have two different empires, but we have a split also within Christendom with two different empires here. You still see that we got some nomadic tribes pushing in. Hopefully you guys can see that blue. Oh, I got some, hold on one second. I want to turn my laser pointer on. There we go, that's better. So we still got nomadic tribes coming in. And this is an important period for us as English speakers, because this is, so what do we have here? We have nomadic tribes in this general area that I don't really have colored in, right? And they are attacking the Rome borders, and they are settling, and they are becoming powerful. And these nomadic tribes are taking their language and moving into Roman territory. And their language, whatever languages they were speaking, is now being mixed with Latin. And we're going to end up with what we call Romance languages, or Latin languages. English, Spanish, English, Spanish, French, things of those natures are going to start coming up because of these nomadic tribes and their invasions of Rome. Okay, so our languages are mixes of these nomadic tribe languages with Latin language. Okay, and so the first one, the largest empire that's going to come up first, is going to be the Franks. The Franks will eventually become France. Okay, and we'll have English-speaking people as well. And eventually, we'll also have Spain and so on and so forth. And Germany, all of those are going to come up later. But that's all going to be the result of these invading forces. This is where it's going to start. And so you have that. Then you see the nomadic tribes end up taking most of Europe there. And that's what's going to bring about those nations that I just talked about. It's going to take some time. We'll talk about more of that world history as we go. But the big one here, even though I'm kind of emphasizing that's only because I want our next section after the Masoretic text is going to be English. We're finally going to get into the first English translation. But you have to understand where English is coming from. So when we get to the English translation, I know when I was a kid, I kind of thought English was from the Tower of Babel. I didn't know it developed during the Middle Ages. I just thought, oh, all the languages came from the Tower of Babel. Every one of them, but that's not exactly how it worked. So anyway, we have these languages developing up here, but really our focus is going to be right down here on this green little patch, which is going to be the beginning of Islam. Islam is showing up. They're starting their religion, and they are developing military power themselves as these things go. And you see they end up conquering this whole area. All right, mostly nomadic tribes and things of that nature. So this is a pretty easy area to take over. And they're converting people to Islam as they do so. And then we go, boom, 8th century, so the 700s, Islam is a world power. They are a proper world power at this point. The Byzantine Empire is weakening. It's going to be a while before the Byzantine Empire truly falls, but it's weakening. Arabic is becoming the lingua franca, and that is going to be downstream of Aramaic. So they're similar, but they're different languages. And Aramaic had made its way through there. And we have the Byzantine Empire, and then we have the nomadic tribes up there. The Franks are established at this point. The Franks are established, and they have recognized themselves as a Christian nation, but they have borders with Muslims and with the Byzantine Empire. And so the Muslim Empire overall, initially, as it came in, was relatively friendly towards Christians and Jews. Let them have their synagogues, give them free access to Israel, which was a big thing for the Jews at the time, because during the Byzantine Empire, there was no free access for Jews to Israel. So Jews felt very oppressed under the Byzantine Christian Empire, and Muslims come in as liberators. But they also saw themselves as an extension of Christianity. So they kept churches, they protected them with laws and things of that nature for a time. That all does eventually change. But early on, there was some peaceful relationships. And we talked about the culture that came about from this, which was different caliphs. So this is the caliphate. Caliphs are the successors of Muhammad, and they're the ones who would run that green area up there. And instead of focusing on military power and conquering, they switched under Al-Mansur to academics. And academics became his focus. And so he sets up a library in Baghdad, in the capital in Baghdad. And the library is called the House of Wisdom. And he wants everyone to bring all of their religious books from all around the world to the House of Wisdom in order to be the center of thought for the world. And so, again, there's relative peace here. So you've got Christians bringing their Latin Bibles, Christians bringing their Greek Bibles. You got the Aramaic Bibles coming in. You've got the Hebrew Bibles coming in. They're all going to this House of Wisdom to be stored there. And so you'd have this center of thought. We compared this to Ptolemy the Great, who did the same thing in Egypt. He wanted the Library of Alexandria to be the center of thought for the world. And so this is a thing back then, is to either conquer through force or conquer through thought. And so House of Wisdom is there to bring all of the sciences. We've got all sorts of things. Astronomy is being developed rapidly during this time period. Lots of different inventions and maths and so on and so forth is coming out of this period. And this is called the Golden Age, the Islamic Golden Age. Islamic Golden Age. We're going to see the end of that when we get to the next lesson. But during this Islamic Golden Age, we see a lot of movement in the sciences. And Israel, or the Jews, I should say, at this point, they had been at this point collecting much of the manuscripts that had been coming down to them and recording the different variants and things of that nature. And what we found was that this time period leads into the time period of the Geonim. The Geonim we talked about last time were the geniuses. Okay, that's the translation of the Hebrew Geonim into English is the translation. It's literally the word pride, but the idea of pride in this sense, in the positive sense that this is being used, would be like the pride of Jacob or the pride of Israel, things of that nature. So the idea was excellence. Okay, it was excellence, right? And so this was the period of the Geonim. The Geonim were basically high-end rabbis who are going to help you understand the Bible and what's required of you and what you must abstain from and things of that nature. So all your positive and negative commands, the Geonim are the ones doing that interpretation. We talked about another group, the Exilarchs. The Exilarchs, they are from the line of David. They're going to be who becomes the next Messiah. That's who they're looking for to be the Messiah, because they reject Jesus, but they need to keep that lineage up, okay? And so we have the Exilarchy moving into the Geonim. We saw that there's controversy when Shlomo dies. His nephews, I think last week I said David's nephews, but it's David's sons, Shlomo's nephews, are vying for power. And it's Anon, the eldest, and Hananiah, the youngest. Hananiah gets chosen as the next Exilarch. Part of the Exilarchy decision was done by Al-Mansur himself. Al-Mansur selects Hananiah officially as well for the Exilarchy. Anon ends up being arrested because he doesn't want to follow this. He wants to be the Exilarch. He keeps claiming that he is the Exilarch, and he gets arrested in the process. While he's in prison, he meets a Muslim man named Abu, and as they talk about their religions, Abu is a philosopher, and he says, the real problem you have, he says to Anon, is that you have all of these different filters by which you have to interpret the Old Testament. You have the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, Jerusalem Talmud, and the Babylonian Talmud, and he says, just reject all of those, not necessarily reject them on at whole, but go back to the scriptures and read them plainly. And Anon loves this idea. He uses it. He thinks this is the right way to go. When he has his trial in front of Al-Mansur, he says, my Judaism is a Judaism of readers. And they become the Ka'arites. The Ka'arites, the Jews in this area split, half of them following the traditional Exilarchs of Hananiah. You got the other half following Anon. But in order for these people to follow Anon, and in order for Anon to push his version of Judaic sola scriptura, scripture alone, we're going to go back to that. We're going to go back to the plain reading. These common people, these Jews, need to learn how to read Hebrew. And there was only one school, as far as I'm aware, that was open at the time who was teaching Hebrew. And the problem was they would come out of this school more confused about Hebrew than when they went in. And I gave you guys one example of that. There's 3 commands here of how you're not supposed to boil a kid in its mother's milk, a young goat. You're not supposed to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And 3 identical commands, yet when you learned Hebrew, you learned that each of those commands had 3 different interpretations. Don't cook it, don't eat it, and don't digest it. And I didn't talk about it last week, but last week, or when I was working through this brought about a whole bunch of laws. Like you couldn't even mix utensils. Like if you had some sort of creamy goat milk soup, you had one set of utensils for that. And if you had roasted goat on another plate, you had a different set of utensils for that. And you couldn't even have them in the same meal. So not only did you not have the same meal, but you had different utensils for those separate meals because you couldn't reuse the utensils that you used for the soup for a later meal to have that roasted goat. You had to have separate utensils for both meals. That's what was going on here. And so it became very easy for people to follow Anon because they're seeing all of this crazy restrictions that they can't interpret on their own. They read, don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Don't do it. And they're like, oh, okay, well, no, there's actually 3 different commands that entirely changes the way we eat. And so they want to go back to the plain reading of the text as well. So Anon gets selected as an exilarchy as well, and as an exilarch, I should say. And Hananiah and Anon have their own separate lines. Anon's exilarchy line is the one that eventually prevails as Hananiah's line dies. And so we go back to that, and then we're at the 8th century, and we're talking about going back to the scriptures. And so the problem is that there are different manuscripts that have come down, and everything's under scrutiny right now. There is scrutinizing the grammar, the syntax, every word. They want to make sure they have it right. And so they've decided that they're going to standardize the text. Because at this point, they have been recognizing that there are textual variants, but each of the schools, the rabbinic schools, are just making note. There's a textual variant here. There's something that this manuscript says differently than this manuscript. They're not trying to reconcile it. They're just putting them in the margins and things of that nature. They're letting people know, and that's the end of it. There's no let's attempt to try to reconcile that. And so they decide to try to reconcile some of these textual variants. And in order to do that, 2 men are selected. We've got Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher. From this point forward, will be known as Ben Asher. And we've got Moshe ben David ben Naphtali, who from this point forward will be called Ben Naphtali. So Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali are selected and are called the Masoretes. The Masoretes, which is they have a fuller name. I forget the actual fuller name, but Masorete means tradition. And the full name that the title was given to them is Master of Tradition. Master of Tradition. So they are in charge of this work. And so what is the work that they have to do? Well, the first job is that they're going to organize. They have to organize the canonical chapters, canonical books, chapters, and verses. And so in order to understand what's going on here, you've got the Septuagint, right? We've already talked about that. There's a whole bunch of books on the Septuagint that aren't canonical. So they're not going to worry about those. Those ones are going to be pushed aside. They're going to worry about just the canonical books. Chapters and verses. And also books, canonical books. So here's another interesting topic I didn't kind of mention last week, is the Hebrew Bible itself doesn't have divisions in it like we do. They don't have 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They have Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. It's not 1st and 2nd. The 1st and 2nd comes about because when the Septuagint translators are translating 1st and 2nd, or Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, when they're translating it, remember the Hebrew text doesn't have vowel points in it. It's a consonantal text, an abjad. We talked about that very early on. It's an abjad text. They don't have vowel points. So when you start adding vowels to all of these words, your text grows substantially. And what they did is they stored these scrolls. When they were done with them, they stored them in pots, and they would seal the pot to keep the scrolls protected. Is that our heater? Yeah. So they would store these scrolls in these pots. In books, it's not going to blow, right? Okay. All right. So they would store them in these pots. And when you get to these particular books, particularly like in the book of Psalms, okay, we still have just the book of Psalms. Some translations will alert you to the fact that there are 5 books to the book of Psalms. Okay. And 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles comes about because the scroll got so big, it wouldn't fit in the pot. So they divided it. And you end up with First Samuel and Second Samuel. So the divisions weren't consistent. Different scrolls had different divisions. So they were going to standardize the divisions of First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. They're going to standardize them, or put them back to just a singular book. So that's one of the things they had to do. The other one was chapters. Where are they going to do the chapter breaks, things of that nature, and where are they going to do the verse breaks? And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Then they were going to do standardizing the vocalization. Okay, how are we pronouncing these words? Remember, these people didn't know Hebrew generally, so their Bible was also going to be their textbook. Okay, and cantillation. How are we going to sing this? Because the Hebrew books were also sung. They weren't just read; they were sung. We talked about that early on. A lot of the Old Testament is in poetry form, but they didn't just sing just the poetry forms. They sung the whole Old Testament, particularly the Torah and the writings. I don't want to overspeak and suggest they also sung the prophets as well, but I think they did. But if they didn't, scratch that, ignore what I said. But they also sung it. So different schools had different ways to sing some of the stuff, so they were going to standardize the singing as well. And then lastly was scribal correction. And this is where they were going to deal with textual variants and things of that nature. So the first thing that they did, we talked about last week, was the organization. We talked about how there wasn't necessarily spaces between all of the words, and that could lead to misreadings. I took this from Paul Wagner's book called Journey from Text to Translation. I don't remember if I mentioned that last week, but that's what this is from. And he gives this example, both these examples, this picture and this example down here. Here is how it would look if we didn't have spaces between our words, and it could lead to misreadings. God is nowhere, or God is now here. Okay, and so how do you work through that? Generally through context, and also we'll get to it. The singing also helps in this area. And so I wanted to look at a particular place where this might be still a controversial area, and Amos 6:12 is one of those places. You have that second line there. Does anyone plow there with oxen, referring to the cliff? If you have a Bible that utilizes italics to let you know that that there are words added for the purpose of clarity, the word there is not is in italics to let you know it's not in the Hebrew. Hebrew scholars say typically there would be a word there, and so it could be more appropriately read as does anyone plow with oxen, which the answer would be yes, when the answers to these questions should be both no. And I'm just going to move quickly. Ultimately, you come down to this. If you remember, this is the original text, potentially the original text here. No vowel points, no spaces. If you break off the last I am here and you add it, supply a vowel point, you get the word see, and does one plow the sea with ox? This would be absurd. The answer is no. That's what we're looking for. Or you could have does one plow with oxen, which is the other way to translate it. There's lots of interesting ways people handle this, but ultimately you're looking for the answer to be no in both cases, and you want it to be as clear as possible. Some say the clearest way to deal with this is to break off a word at the end. Others say it's just implied intuitively. You should just understand through context that the word there should be there. In either event, the answer is no. That's what we're looking for. If you're looking in your Bibles now, I see some of you looking. Your NKJV is going to say plow there with oxen. It's your NET, NIV, I think, will be the two that you'll read. Do you plow the sea with oxen? Most of them stick with the traditional text of the Masoretic text. The CSB provides a footnote here that says that the text is amended, right? So they're changing the Masoretic text in order to get to the understanding that do you plow the sea with ox? Okay, all right. So yeah, that's the text is amended. All right, and so that's organization. So they're working through how do you organize the text? Okay, so where do the word breaks occur? Okay, That's one way they have to do it. The next is pronunciation. Here is where they're going to add the vowel points, okay? The vowel points are going to be added so we know how to pronounce the words. The pronunciation has been handed down, okay? People understood how to pronounce a lot of these words. In fact, one of the things I mentioned was that the common Jewish person did have particular prayers memorized. They didn't know what they meant, but they had them memorized, and they would recite them. So they understood how to recite some of these prayers, even though they didn't know what they meant. And if you don't know, I do this all the time. Have you only ever read a word and then you heard someone say it and you're like, oh, that's how you pronounce that? I have never pronounced it that way in my head. So things of that nature are happening in the Jewish community as well, where they're reading it and they're like, oh, that's how you pronounce that? So Ben Asher, he's the one who's adding this particular set of vowel points and pronunciation, accents, and things of that nature. And so this dialect that he's using is called Tiberian Hebrew. He believed this was the closest to the original Hebrew. We have found out since then that there are other versions even older than his that might be even closer, or I should say contemporary with his that might be closer. We haven't found any older. But he and others had attempted to do vowel points of some kind before. His is the one that sticks. So we've found other manuscripts that are contemporary with his that have vowel pointing that are entirely different than his. And all they are is a representation of how to pronounce the word. So the pronunciation is different. It's a different dialect, not entirely. I say entirely different, entirely in the fact that their symbols are different. The pronunciation is slightly different. It'd be similar to maybe a good example might be like Southern American versus Boston, right? And you could see that difference. We understand each other fine, but we pronounce things very differently. Okay, it'd be like that. Yeah, so what was also interesting is Ben Asher does not want to change the consonantal text. He does not want to insert new letters in between the consonants. So he devises a system of points and dashes that he can move above the letters, below the letters, and inside the letters, but nothing to separate the consonants. He wants the consonantal text to stay the same and add all of these points around the letters for the purpose of pronunciation. He did not want to invent new letters that would divide up the consonantal text. I thought that was really interesting. And so this becomes the pronunciation of Ben Asher. He was also dealing with a number of different dialects. He wanted to standardize the dialect of the Hebrew people. He was worried that it was going to split into particular dialects that would end up as different languages altogether. That's what his concern was. It didn't happen. In fact, Hebrew today, I was listening to, I don't know Hebrew this well, but he was giving different examples of how Tiberian Hebrew would sound different than modern Hebrew, and he would show different examples of how that, and I thought it was interesting, but I won't get into that with you. The next one was cantillation. This is the area I understood the least. Let me just say present tense. I understand the least. I do not understand everything that's going on here. I do not have a musical background. They were using technological terms. Maybe someday Phil can tackle this. But they were different words would have different keys. The Torah was in a major key, if I'm understanding correctly, and the writings were in a minor key. And anyway, I'm not the guy to teach this particular subject. I don't know what he did. I do know that because of the way they sung and their cantillation that was involved, this helped them understand where to break the words, right? So when you get the string of consonants, where do we break the words? Well, their meter helped them understand where to break the words, okay? And I'm hoping I'm not conflating too many musical terms here, but I'm just not the person to teach this section, so I'm gonna move on. I know it helped, and I know they standardized it, but I don't know all the processes. We're gonna get into the next section, and this is the section that really interests me, and it's the section that I really do understand what's going on, and that's scribal correction. And this is where they're going to deal with textual variants. Now, it's just like New Testament textual criticism. This is Old Testament. There aren't like all of these major differences that are going to cause major doctrinal issues or anything of that nature, but there are minor issues all over the place that they have to decide what to do with. One of the main ones, okay, I should say not main, but one of the most prominent ones is what to do with the divine name. We talked about this already when we went to the Septuagint. Well, when we talked about it in the Septuagint, I talked about how you would pronunciate the divine name. They would put the Adonai vowels on the divine name, so to let you know to say Adonai. Well, that's what some scribes did, and that was the standard practice. Other scribes didn't write the divine name at all. They wrote Adonai, or they wrote Elohim, which is the word for God in Hebrew. They wrote Elohim, or they wrote Adonai, and they did not write the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters that make up the divine name for Yahweh or Jehovah, however you want to pronounce it. They didn't do that. So you have all of these manuscripts that they've collected, and they've got one that says Elohim, one that says Adonai, and one that says the divine name. And they have to decide which one of these is going to go in the text. All right. And so what we see when we look at some of the manuscripts that still are extant, I just chose Elohim here as an example, is that when you had 2 manuscripts that said Yahweh and one that said Elohim, they went with Yahweh. And if you had 2 that had Yahweh, you had 2 that had Elohim and one that said Yahweh, they would go with Elohim, and things of that nature. And so they would primarily what we found is in most cases where there was a discrepancy, Yahweh was put in. They put in Yahweh more often than not, but not 100% of the time. And the assumption is that the scribes were changing Yahweh so as not to pronounce the name. And so if they found a manuscript with the word Yahweh, that was probably the original reading. They didn't pick that in every circumstance, but in most circumstances, that was the norm. The other thing that they did is they did not attempt to reconcile every textual variant. There are many textual variants that ended up in a footnote. And so there's all sorts of stuff going on here, but essentially you've got these markings in the center margin here that relate to a word in here that causes the reader to go down here and read a footnote, okay? Very similar to how we do it today. We put a little superscription number. We just don't put it in the center margin. We put it right next to the word. But theirs was in the center margin, and it pointed the reader to the bottom. This footnote would be a particular reading. So let me see here. I've got a lot of notes here, but I don't think I need to spend this much time here. Yeah, okay. These readings, okay. I know some of you have an NKJV. We're going to talk about the NKJV quite a bit right now because the NKJV is the only translation currently that I'm aware of, printed translation. I've got digital ones that do it. Printed translation that deal with these textual variants by name. So what is in this text here is called the Ketib reading. Ketib, that's what's in the text. The footnote is called the Kir reading. Okay, Ketib and Kir. Ketib means what is written. That's what's in the text. Kir means what is said. So when a scribe would get up and he would start to read the scriptures, he would come across the Ketib reading. He would see the footnote, he'd go down, and he would say the Kir reading. It was a form of correcting the text. The Masoretes were careful. They didn't want to change the text. They wanted to change the text as little as possible, but they recognized that there were scribal errors. Instead of changing the text, they put a Kir reading at the footnote, letting you know this is what we think is the correct reading. And so I will give you some of those places where they show up in our scriptures today. All right, Isaiah 9:3. If you're reading from an NKJV, you'll see you have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. But if you're reading the KJV, you will see thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased its joy. Well, these are completely opposite readings. Either he increased the joy or he did not increase the joy. Let me show you how different translations are going to handle this issue. All right. I don't know if you guys can read this. I didn't realize it was going to be this small, but if you read the footnote for the LSB, it says Masoretic text says not increase. I have a problem with the LSB footnote here. We'll explain why in a minute. I don't like this footnote. If you read the NASB 20 footnote, it says another reading is not increase. That's true. It's another reading. It just doesn't tell you where that reading comes from. If you read the CSB, it says alternate Hebrew tradition has not increased joy. This one is difficult for most people because they don't know what that means, alternate Hebrew tradition. I do. It means Kier. They're talking about the Kier reading or the Ketib reading. They're talking about whichever one they chose, it's the other one. Okay? They're just not naming it by name. I wish they did, but they said they instead chose to use alternate Hebrew. Understood. If you go to the KJV, unfortunately, Blue Letter Bible does not have the footnotes for the KJV. Drives me nuts when publishers do not put the footnotes in, especially for the KJV. But my my Logos software does, and they have a footnote right here, right here. And this footnote, I apparently didn't copy it. Is it on the next line? No, I didn't. They have a footnote here that reads the Kier reading, and it just says, or increased. Oh, no, I do. I have it right here. Or to him. Or to him. And so it says, thou hast multiplied the nation, and to him, the him is the pronoun referring to the nation. Most translations today use it. They use him. It's the same thing. But they're letting you know that there's another reading here that's the opposite. All right, in the footnote. We'll get to KJV footnotes later. But here's what the NKJV does. And I really appreciate the NKJV here. It says, following Kier and Targum, Ketib and Vulgate read not increased joy. The Septuagint reads essentially the same thing of the Kier reading. So they actually name it, the Kier reading, okay, as opposed to the Ketib reading. I really like that. It lets me know exactly where I need to go look when I'm doing my research on that, so that I get it from the CSB only because I understand it, only because I've done this like 30 times, and I know I've seen the consistency. Oh, they mean we chose the other reading of whatever one we have in the text. Okay. I'll give you another one. So this is where we're following the Kier reading. What's the Kier reading? The NKJV and all translations are following the footnote in the text of the Masoretic text of what we would call Codex Aleppo. All right, of what Ben Asher did. Okay, here's another one. Another way you'll see it expressed is this word "nay" here is in italics in both the KJV and the NKJV, but the NASB and the LSB, which also use italics, they don't put it in italics. The reason being is because this word is in the Kier reading. And for whatever reason, they decided to put it in italics to suggest that there isn't underlying Hebrew support, but there is. So I really prefer the translations here that don't use the italics to let you know that there is underlying Hebrew support here. In fact, it's interesting to me that the KJV translators themselves, this is the old Gothic font that they used to use. And when they wanted to use italics, they would put it in Roman font here, like this. Okay. And so this is not in Roman font, so it's not italicized. But our modern KJVs do have it italicized. So the initial 1611 KJV translators did not italicize the word. Later editors did. I agree with the original 1611 translators on this issue. I don't think it should be italicized because it is part of the Masoretic text. All right, moving quickly. Okay, there's another issue I could give you. If you go to you can mark this down, 2 Kings 19:31, it will say Lord of Hosts. KJV will have it in italics, of hosts in italics. Most translations won't put it in italics if they have it there, but it's a Kier reading. And but the translations are somewhat split on which direction to go with the Kier reading here or to go to the Ketib reading. But if you see that there, that's why. That's one of the reasons. So we talked about when we did the LXX, I'm behind where I want to be, so I'm going to move really quickly. Maybe I'll pick up some of this in the review next week. But when we did the Septuagint, we talked about the family of Septuagint translations, the family of texts, Symmachus, Theodotion, Origen, so on. There's a whole family of texts. Well, we have the same issue with Masoretic texts. We have a family of texts. We have the Proto-Masoretic text, where the consonantal text identically matches the Masoretic text without vowels. Okay, so we call those the Proto-Masoretic text. Then we have Codex Aleppo. That's what Ben Asher did. We have that text today. Then we have the Leningrad text, which is a copy of Ben Asher's text with some minor variations. Then we have the Rabbinic Bibles. They come out. The Rabbinic Bibles are copies of the previous text that I just mentioned. The biggest difference is going to be vowel pointings here and there, a couple of different paragraph markings and such. But the Rabbinic Bibles are going to be Masoretic texts with study notes in them, commentary. Okay, so we have those commentaries. Of the Rabbinic Bibles, the second one, I believe it's the second one, is the Joseph ben Chaim Bible. Okay, the Joseph ben Chaim Rabbinic Bible is then printed in printed form. We have the printing press at this point. So it's the first printed Bible. And that printed Bible, which is the Joseph ben Chaim Bible, is the Daniel Bomberg Bible, 1525. Where are we? We're at the beginning of the Reformation. Every Reformation era Bible is going to be using the Bomberg Bible to do their Old Testament. Okay. And then we've got the Biblia Hebraica in 1906. We're going to circle back to this because I'm out of time. And the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Okay, Stuttgartensia, 1977. When I was in a church that taught KJV onlyism, they gave me the impression that the Hebrew texts that underlied all contemporary English translations were distinct from the KJV, the Bomberg. The Stuttgartensia Bible was different than the Bomberg one. Let me give you a clip, and then I'll deal with the clip next week. Okay, here we go.
The ESV is based on the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, as found in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, was produced by Rudolf Kittel. He and his son Gerard were involved in producing Hebrew lexicons and actually had influence over Hitler and his pogroms. In fact, Rudolf's son was arrested and imprisoned at the end of World War II for Nazi war crimes against Jews. That bothers me a bit because Paul says in Romans 3, what advantage hath the Jew? Much every way, for chiefly to them was committed the oracles of God. So if God said, I'm going to commit the oracles to the Jews, and then we have a Bible based on a text produced by a guy who hated Jews so much that he assisted in the attempted extermination of the Jews, I don't think God was anywhere near his work.
Okay, that is his argument, that your ESV is based on a Jew-hating man. I'm going to tackle that argument next week, so I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger. Come back next week to find out how we reconcile this issue and what's wrong with his actual arguments. And yeah, that's what we'll pick up next week. I don't normally leave you on cliffhangers like that, but I'm getting a kick out of it today. All right. You all are dismissed.